You're listening to the VSL Aviation Podcast. I'm your host, Seth Lake. Welcome back. If you're joining us on YouTube, I really appreciate that as well. Just so you know, all the podcast listeners, I do a YouTube show as well. I've got some visual aids. I try to keep it as audio friendly as possible, but on occasion I do videos that are really heavy, kind of video based, so they're only on YouTube. So if you're listening on podcast, check out the YouTube channel. If you're watching on YouTube, check out the podcast. But today's episode, we're continuing our deep dive into the private pilot airman certification standards. If you weren't with us on the last episode, I really suggest that you check that out first, because we're going through the private pilot ACS task by task. And in the last episode, we talked about Area of Operation 1, Task A, and today we're moving to Task B. So we're going to kind of continue that discussion of scenario-based questioning in preparation for your private pilot exam. If you're not studying for your private pilot exam, still stay tuned, because we're going to talk about a lot of pertinent information that'll make you a safer pilot, I think, and you'll probably wind up learning something, I promise. So I've got my ACE document pulled up here. I'll do a quick plug for this. This is a great one-stop shop for your studying. I try to use it on these podcasts because you can kind of see how easy it is to navigate some of the stuff we're going to talk about. So we're going to start with the private pilot ACS, Area of Operation 1, and we're going to Task B, which is Airworthiness Requirements. So today is all about airworthiness. So this might go a little bit longer because airworthiness is kind of a complicated subject. Now, again, listen to episode 1. You'll know how the knowledge topics, risk management topics, and skill topics work. But just to give a general overview of this particular task, we have in knowledge topics, we really have 3 broad knowledge topics, but they're broken down into about 8 different, because we have some sub-knowledge topics. So this is the first time we see, for instance, we have knowledge topic 1, and then we have knowledge topic 1A, 1B, 1C. We have knowledge topic 2, then knowledge topic 3, and 3A, 3B, 3C, 3D. So this is the first time we've seen kind of the knowledge topics broken down into subcategories. But those are general knowledge elements. We only have 1 risk management element, and then we have 3 skill elements. So remember, the ultimate goal of this task is to cover all 3 skill elements. I have to cover at least 1 knowledge topic and at least 1 risk management topic. The FAA also wants me to ask this question in a scenario-based format. If you're following along on the ACE guide, I have an example scenario along with the questions and answers there. If you're just listening to the podcast, I'm not going to use that exact scenario. I'm just going to talk about some basic scenarios that I might use as an examiner to sample this knowledge topic. A classic one, and the one that the FAA has as their example, is we're going to pretend like you're getting ramp checked or ramp inspection by an FAA safety investigator. So an FAA safety ASI has met you out at the airplane, and they're doing ramp inspections at the airport you're departing from. So they approach you and say, hey, we're going to give you a ramp inspection. I'm from the FAA. Classic, I'm from the FAA. I'm here to help. And they show you their ID, and okay, now what? What do you need to do? Because you're a little panicked. It's like getting pulled over from the police. You feel like, oh man, the FAA is really out to get me. And the fact of the matter is they're not. I promise, they're not out to get you. They're just doing some ramp inspections. So, and we can even talk about later what might happen if the ramp inspection doesn't go well. In fact, we will talk about that. But let's just say you're a little, nervous at least, and you provide them with your required documents. We talked about in the last episode. So you provided them with all your required documents, and then they ask to see all the airplane's required documents. So a lot of us start thinking, okay, AERO, right? You've heard the AERO acronym. That's our airworthiness, our registration, our weight and balance, our operating handbook, our radio operator license if we need it. If we're not flying outside the continental U.S., then we don't need that. But big thing is the airworthiness, registration, weight and balance, operating manual. I hear that all the time. Almost every single check ride I hear the AERO acronym. So let's break that down. First of all, you hand that over to the examiner, or the ASI in this case. They might ask, hey, do you know when this registration expires? So knowing when a registration is valid for, of course you can look on the registration. That was a recent rule change. went out to 7 years from what it was previously. And hopefully all of those have been up to date with. But that, I'm sampling your knowledge now as an examiner by that scenario, by just asking that simple question of, hey, when's that expire? The other one is the airworthiness certificate. So the airworthiness certificate actually doesn't expire, but we have to do a lot of things or ensure a lot of things are done as a pilot to make sure the airworthiness certificate is still valid. So that's what we're going to get into with inspections and stuff. Next is the operating manual or operating limitations. So the operating limitations have to be on the airplane. What does that mean? And that may sound silly, but I've had some people bring a copy of the POH that they've downloaded from the internet for a 172. Does that count as the operating limitations? Well, it kind of depends. The type certificate data sheet, which we're going to talk about, but the TCDS for like the 172, for instance, says an approved flight manual is required to be on board. So not only do you have to have the operating limitations of the 172, which could be found in maybe any old POH that you download, but you need the actual flight manual for that aircraft. So there needs to be kind of an N-number approved flight manual on board the airplane. Now, you've given all this over to the theoretical ASI, and they've looked at your airplane and said, yeah, you're good to go. That is one option there. The other thing that I might do, now kind of stepping back in my examiner shoes, is I say, hey, the ASI starts walking around. They can't legally, they can't open up and like search your plane without you giving them permission. We kind of get into a whole legal realm there. I did a whole video series for 2 videos on ramp inspections, by the way, so you can go back in the video feed and look at that if you want to learn more about how this would actually go. But there's a lot that an ASI, just looking at your airplane from outside, they can look in and say, oh, I've noticed that you've got a Garmin 430 in the plane. Now this is let's say it's a 1970 172. I know that Garmin 430 didn't come installed in that airplane, so it must have been installed later. So that brings us down the road of there's probably some other stuff in addition to the flight manual that needs to be on the airplane, because in order for that 430 installation to be legal, there needs to be an STC for it, which is a supplemental type certificate. I'll add that to the list to talk to about later. But there needs to be an STC for that 430, and that 430 also needs some sort of flight manual or flight supplement that needs to be on board the airplane for that to be a valid installation. So we're already kind of beyond the scope of the Aero. The Aero is a really simple tool that we use of, hey, we need these 4 things to be on the airplane to be legal. Yeah, that's not actually right. You need more than that to be legal typically. In a lot of the flight training fleet that I see out there, there's a lot of airplanes with stuff, aftermarket stuff that's been installed, and all of those require some sort of flight supplement to be in the operating handbook. Okay, so let me see. Go back and talk about all the things I said I was going to talk about now. We've covered all the required equipment to be on there. So where are we at in the task? So knowledge topic 1 is general airworthiness requirements and compliance for airplanes, including the following, and it goes through A, B, C, and D. So so now we're on knowledge topic 1A, certificate location and expiration dates. So we've checked that box because I've asked you where the registration has to be. So that one has to be in view from the passengers, and then what are the expiration dates? That's a real easy one, guys. Come prepared to the check ride with, if you don't want to take it out of the airplane, just take a picture of it and say, hey, here's the picture of the plane's certificate. I know when it expires. Do I expect you to have that memorized? No, I really don't. I don't expect you to have it memorized, but I do expect you to check that date to make sure that it's not behind us, right? Because that's your job as a pilot in command, is to make sure you don't unintentionally fly an airplane with an expired registration. Okay, so expiration date on that's A. Then B is required inspections and airplane logbook documentation. So that's something we haven't covered in this scenario. So that's where we kind of get out of the scenario, because somebody doing a ramp inspection, the FAA could ask, if they're doing a ramp inspection on you, they could ask, hey, do you have the aircraft maintenance logs? Well, no, I don't. Do you have any sort of reference sheet that lists when the annual is completed. Well, no, I don't. Okay, that's fine. It's not required, but a lot of owners do something similar to that. There's a lot of applications out there nowadays that track when different inspections are due. So I've even done that before while being ramp inspected, is just show, hey, here's my application that we use to track this. You can see that the annual was last performed, 6 months ago, and the ADs are all in compliance because we've, flown less than that, and 100 hours not due because we're not doing this for hire. You can show all that from a quick data sheet there. So in the nature or in the course of the check ride, you should have all that information. So this would be the time where I bring that up as an examiner, as I would bring up that airworthiness certificate again. And I'd say, okay, well, Seth, the registration expires, right? But it's valid. The airworthiness doesn't expire, but you have to do certain things for that airworthiness certificate to be valid. Could you talk me through those? And that would lead us to, okay, well, we need to have our inspections done. So what inspections need to be done? So this is your opportunity to be able to go through and show, here's my annual. Typically, if you're at a flight school, it'll also have 100-hour. So my annual 100-hour, well, what types of things are we checking during that annual and 100-hour? And those are things listed in a typical annual and 100-hour inspection. Also include like the ELT battery, right? We've got time limitations on that. We have limitations on when our pedostatic system, our altimeter encoder, so we refer to those as the 91, 411, and 413. All of those inspections that you probably have tabbed out in the maintenance logs, or should, if you don't, tab those out in the maintenance logs. That's the time where you're going to bring all that up as knowledge topic B. Now, knowledge topic C, airworthiness directives and special airworthiness information bulletins. Specifically, the first part of that sentence, the special airworthiness information bulletins don't get covered a lot in the flight training, Part 91 world, but the airworthiness directives are required, right? ADs you have to comply with. So those ADs, those are also probably covered in the annual and 100-hour. And if they're not, we need to find where those are located. This is a really common area to have some weakness on. You need to be pretty familiar, I would say, with your flight training aircraft. Figure out how many reoccurring ADs it has. This would be a really good time to tell the examiner, hey, I don't have these memorized, but I know the Cessna 172 we're flying today has 3 reoccurring ADs. They're due every 100 hours, and they were accomplished 75 hours ago. I'm going to reference the manuals because I have to, but that right there, that comment shows me, hey, you actually understand the implications of these ADs. You've got it tabbed out here. You clearly know what you're talking about, and I'm not going to ask a lot more questions on ADs after that. Now, if I say, if you don't mention ADs at all, and I say, typically I'll point to the AD, and it'll have the AD verbiage in the logbook, and I'll say, hey, what does that mean right there? And the applicant's usually like, airworthiness directive. It means airworthiness directive. Okay, tell me about airworthiness directives. What are they? And we might play around with the scenario a little bit, or I might do some questions of, let's say we weren't in a flight school aircraft. Are airworthiness directives required if we're not in a plane that's for hire? And the answer is yes. ADs are required for everybody. Now, a really common one, if you're watching this and you're not part of a flight school, let's say you're an independent owner, you own your own airplane, and you're taking training in it. You probably know that 100 hours aren't required. However, the 172, I keep bringing that up because it's a really common training aircraft, but the 172 actually has, a lot of 172s have a seat rail AD that's due every 100 hours. So I've actually run into this where I have a private owner that's not accomplishing 100-hour inspections. He did his annual, let's say 7 months ago, and he's been flying a lot. He's flown like 300 hours. So now the airplane has 300 hours since the last annual, hasn't had any 100 hours done, and I don't see any log of the seat rail AD being complied with. So if it was done, if the annual was done and the AD was complied with then, and he's since flown 300 hours, there should be 3 AD compliance entries in the logbook regarding the seat rail since the last annual. And those were going to be separate. They're not going to be within an annual inspection write-up, right? They're going to be separate, so I should see 3 of those. If I don't see 3 of those, hey, this plane looks like it has an uncomplied with AD, and we're no longer airworthy because this AD isn't complied with. I've actually canceled several check rides because I found ADs that just weren't complied with. And the typical answer I get is, oh no, that my mechanic did that, he just forgot to log it. Well, okay, but we can't execute a check ride based on what you're telling me your mechanic did, right? Your mechanic has to properly put that in the logbook entry for me to see that as a valid airworthiness directive. So make sure you don't have to know every single AD for the 172, because there's actually 2 types of ADs, right? There's reoccurring, and then there's one-time ADs. The majority of ADs on your aircraft are going to be one-time ADs, and they're going to be quite old typically. So they might be, if you've got a 1970s Air 172, you might have several ADs that were complied with back in the 80s or in the early 90s. And they were just one-time ADs, complied with, don't have to worry about them again. The ones that I want you to worry about are those reoccurring ADs. Those are the ones that you really need to be familiar with as a pilot. And, if you're not in the flight training system and you're just listening to this to learn something, any plane that you go out and fly or go out and rent or borrow, that's one of the first things that I'm going to look at. I'm going to look in the maintenance logs. I'm going to see that it's compliant with the annual. I'm going to make sure the registration is current. And then I'm going to look and see if there's a recent AD list and that I'm not coming up on any ADs. The reoccurring ADs I've seen them as short as 10 hours, 25 hours. Those are pretty rare, but a 100-hour AD is actually pretty common. I can think of 4 or 5, flight training aircraft that have 100-hour ADs. So I want to know about those as a piloting command. All right, on to D, purpose and procedure for obtaining a special flight permit. That's one of the options. Now, remember, we don't have to cover this knowledge topic unless you missed it on the written exam. We could ask this, though, because, again, I have the full authority. I could ask all of the knowledge topics, but I only have to sample at least one of these knowledge topics. So in this case, this is one that we might talk about a little bit, but I typically don't build a scenario around getting a special ferry permit because that can be kind of a complicated thing. I've done that several times as a professional pilot and managing other people's airplanes. Of getting a special ferry permit is kind of an ordeal. I wouldn't necessarily think that a 141 private pilot student knows how to get a special ferry permit. They've probably never done it, or a special flight permit. But we will maybe play with the scenario of saying, okay, well, let's say that while we're looking through the logbooks, we notice that the annual expired last month. The only mechanic we can find is actually 50 miles away, and we would like to be able to fly the airplane over to that mechanic to get the annual done. Is there any way that we could do that? And about the level of knowledge that I want you to have as a private pilot is to know, I think I can get a special flight permit to fly that airplane on a one-time flight to a location to get maintenance completed. That's fine, right? That's about the level of knowledge that I expect you to have. We're not going to have an in-depth discussion about the procedures and website you go to, and you got to get a notary and go through X, Y, or Z to get a special flight permit. I'm not going to demand that type of knowledge level, but just know, hey, there is a process to get a special flight permit, and know some of the reasons why I might need one of those. And a very common one is the plane's out of annual, and I need to fly it somewhere to get that annual completed. Okay, next, pilot. So this is knowledge topic 2, pilot performed preventative maintenance. So I've got a link in the ACE guide, and this takes us actually to the Appendix A, Part 43C. So FAR Part 43 is part of the Federal Aviation Regulations, and Part 43 specifically talks about maintenance, preventative maintenance, rebuilding, and alteration. So it's really the maintenance rulebook, right? But Appendix A of Part 43 goes through some definitions, and it defines major alterations, repairs, and preventative maintenance. So we are allowed, per the regulations, owners or pilots of airplanes can perform preventative maintenance, right? This is stuff like changing the oil. Now, I might ask, what types of items are included on that preventative maintenance list. So that's why I gave a link in the ACE guide to Appendix A. If you go down to Part C in the appendix, that covers preventative maintenance. And in there, again, this is a great example of why I love using the ECFR website, is you've got this nice indentation. So you can see that in Subpart C of Appendix A, we have 31 items. So there's 31 items that we can do as pilots of an airplane that are considered preventative maintenance. I may even ask, well, are we limited to just those 31 items, or could we do a little bit more? And a good example of this is you can see that the first item here is a removal, installation, repair of landing gear tires. So what you'll notice is missing from that statement is it doesn't say anything about inflating a tire, putting air in a tire. Nowhere in the preventative maintenance section does it say that I can add air to a tire. Now it says I can remove, install, repair a landing gear tire, but it doesn't say that I can put air into it. Now a lot of people would say, well, yeah, Seth, it's common sense. If you can repair a landing gear tire, you must be able to put air into it. But that's typically not how the FAA regulations work. They typically don't just rely on common sense. They have to give you some sort of specific permission of, yes, you can put air in that. What happens here in this case of Appendix A is there's actually a legal interpretation, the Khalil interpretation, I think I'm pronouncing that right, that explains, that you're not just limited to these 31 things. If the item that you're doing is closely related to one of those 31 things, then you can do that too. But it's probably a good idea to include this legal interpretation in there. So for our legal interpretations, we can go to our global menu on the ACE guide. Legal interpretations, they're in alphabetical order. The Khalil 2009. This is the legal interpretation that basically we can use as pilots to say, hey, if it's closely related to one of the items in Appendix A, paragraph C, then I can do that as well. Now, you want to be careful with this, right? I'm not advocating at all that you go out and you try to do maintenance that you're not prepared to do, right? If you're not comfortable doing maintenance on an airplane, then by all means, do not do that maintenance. Don't feel like you have to because it's listed in one of those 32 things. I just list this as trying to expand your knowledge a little bit. There's a legal interpretation that's associated with this knowledge topic in particular that kind of gets referenced a lot. So having knowledge of that Khalil letter of interpretation, that's good. And this is just another example of how if you can show your examiner that you don't just have rote memorization of tomato flames, which I'll talk about in a second. But if you know me, you know that I don't love that term. You don't have rote memorization here. You have kind of a fundamental understanding. That's one, that's going to make you a safer pilot. Two, it's going to help you have a much more successful check ride because we can really detect that pretty quickly on somebody that's really crammed for this exam the past 5 days, and then somebody that has a deep kind of mastery of the aircraft and the knowledge, and they've really dug into it and they really understand it. Is noticeably different when you're dealing with one applicant or the next between those two. So having that kind of deeper understanding, and you're well on your way. Listen to this podcast. I'm showing you how to find that information. It's all free. It's all out there. All right, so the next part we've got, that was Knowledge 2. Knowledge 3, equipment requirements for day and night VFR flight to include, and then it lists A, B, C, and D. So A is flying with inoperative equipment. So we can find that reference in 91.213. 91.213 is our flying with inoperative equipment regulation. So I would expect you to not have that memorized, but to know, if I'm flying with inoperative equipment, I'm going to reference 91.213 to make sure I'm doing it appropriately. That's a really great answer. Love that answer. Using an approved minimum equipment list. This is in part 9167. Now, an approved MEL is very rare actually in the flight training world, right? Not a lot of 172s out there have an approved MEL. And what that means is you have a letter of authorization to use a minimum equipment list. That is a rare thing. Honestly, I've never seen it for a 172. Now, what is very common is the next line is C, using a kinds of operation equipment list, or KOEL. A KOEL is much more common in the flight training world than an MEL. Now, kind of, if you're doing a commercial ride, which this is all about private pilot, but as a commercial pilot, it's much more likely that you run into an MEL. But as a private pilot, it's really rare. I know the FAA has to make these ACSs kind of a one-size-fits-all, and you might be flying an airplane that has an MEL as a private pilot. I think it's safe to say that would be the exception, not the rule. So most of the planes out there that I've dealt with don't have an MEL, but they do have a KOEL, especially the newer aircraft. Now, don't worry if you've never heard of a KOEL and you're like, Seth, I don't have a KOEL and I don't have an MEL. That's perfectly normal too. That's probably the second most common. Is a lot of our older flight training equipment, so our 172s that were kind of produced maybe before the M model 172, they don't have a KOEL. Are you nervous about an upcoming check ride? Have you ever wondered what it's like to be a designated pilot examiner? In this show, I give you a behind-the-scenes look of the FAA check ride process. I'll show you best practices on how to have a successful check ride, common errors that applicants struggle with, and share with you some of the valuable knowledge I've gained throughout my 15-year career in military and civilian aviation. For more information about the show, visit our website, vsl.aero/podcast. There you'll find the show library, various ways to support the show, and links to purchase our interactive Airman certification standards study guide. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a 5-star review. Most importantly, tell your aviation friends about the show. This is listener-supported content, and I plan on keeping it that way. So any way you can support the show through Patreon or PayPal is greatly appreciated. Consider how much you would normally pay for an hour of ground school with an experienced CFI. Thanks for listening, and back to the show. They don't have an MEL. So what's the required equipment? And this brings up a really good discussion point of what is your required equipment. And you're probably thinking, well, Seth, you already said it. It's tomato flames. So I don't like tomato flames. The reason is it's that rote memorization, right? It's a tool we use to rote memorize these list of components. And here's how this kind of breaks down. Here's the fallacy of tomato flames. I, in the scenario, say, this is a scenario I use really often. You turn the master switch on and you don't hear anything. So what does that mean? Well, typically on an old 6-pack airplane, when you turn the master switch on, you energize the battery bus, right? That battery bus then powers your electric instruments. Well, typically you only have one electric instrument, and that's your turn coordinator, right? The gyroscope in your turn coordinator is typically electric. So the noise that you hear when you turn the master switch on is actually the electrically powered gyro in your turn coordinator coming up to speed, right? It's not an avionics cooling fan. It's not the battery. It's not the alternator. It's not, these are all answers that I've gotten. It's that little gyro that's in that instrument. So when you turn the master on and you don't hear anything, and the rest of your electrical system seems to work, then look at your turn coordinator. Turn coordinator might be inoperative. What do we do? Can we fly without that? So the applicant thinks, well, tomato flames doesn't include turn coordinator. And I'll ask them, well, where can we find tomato flames? What is that in reference to? And that's in reference to 91.205. That's really the answer that I want is, hey, I have a piece of inoperative equipment. Where should I look? 91.205. Great answer. Love that. Tomato flames, don't give me that. Don't like that. So they go to 91.205. They verify, yeah, we can't find the turn coordinator in there. It must not be required for this flight. So yeah, we can press without it. I'm like, well, hold up. We can just take off without this turn coordinator working. Isn't there something else we need to do? And they think, oh, yeah, 91.213. I need to placard this instrument as inoperative, and I need to disable that instrument. If me disabling that instrument required any maintenance action, then an AMP needs to do that action, and it needs to be documented in the maintenance logbook, and have until the next required inspection to either remove or repair that component. That's pretty much a perfect answer, right? If you spat that off, we're moving to the next step. You know your stuff. Unfortunately, that's not typically the way that it gets answered. But anyway, the turn coordinator is now inoperative. And so, okay, you've demonstrated proficiency of using 91205 and 91213. So we've covered some of the knowledge topics, right? So your understanding's good. But then I ask, well, okay, now you do the walk around and you notice that the right aileron is missing. Can we go fly without the right aileron? Now, I've never had anybody say, yeah, no problem. I'm going to go fly without the right aileron. Most people are like, oh, no, we can't fly without the right aileron. Well, hold up a minute. That the right aileron is not listed in 91205. Like, yeah, but we need it because it would be unsafe if we didn't have that. I'm like, okay, granted, that would be unsafe. That's a flight control. So kind of intuitively, yeah, we couldn't fly with that. What about the passenger door, though? Passenger door is not listed in 91205, right? We've got a seat belt that's required, but the door, that's not listed. And the door is not an aerodynamic component necessarily, right? You can fly with the door off. Could we fly with the door off? It's like 50-50. Some people say, yeah, we can, and some people say, no, we can't. But the point is, I'm trying to point out how 91205, if you gathered all of the components of 91205, you would have a box of parts, right? You wouldn't have a flyable airplane, much less an airworthy airplane. So 91205 really is not an all-inclusive list. So those are the bare bones requirements for just any airplane. And the way I've explained this before is this is kind of think of it as the foundation of your house, right? You can't live in a foundation, right? If you were to say, hey, I'm going to build a house, and you pour a concrete slab. Like, all right, house is done. You just have a concrete slab. Now, you have to have that concrete slab in order to build a house eventually, but a concrete slab is just concrete slab, right? You can't live in it. It's not a house. You've got to build a house on top of that. And then a building inspector has to come in and approve that house as being safe, right? Just because the concrete was inspected and safe doesn't mean that the house that you built on it is safe, right? It has to be built to specifications and have certain things like a roof and electricity and plumbing and all that. So think of 91205 as the foundation of an airplane. It's not the airplane at all. It's just the foundation of an airplane. So if you're missing a component from 91205, yeah, you're not airworthy. But also, you could be missing a component that's not in 91205, and you're also unairworthy. The classic example is the stall warning horn or stall warning device that's installed on a 172. The stall warning device that's installed on a Cessna 172 is not required by 91205, but it is required by the type certificate data sheet for the Cessna 172. So it would be a good idea for you to have the TCDS for whatever airplane you're taking your check ride in and be somewhat familiar with it. Again, I don't expect you to have this memorized. I just would like everyone to know what a TCDS is and what types of information we could find there. So if you don't have a KOEL and you don't have an MEL, it's a really good idea to have at least the TCDS because every single certified airplane has a type certificate data sheet. Now, the way we find the TCDS, I would say, hey, it's fairly straightforward. It's a little complicated, to be honest, but I'll show you here real quick. You're going to go, and I'll talk my way through this. Don't worry if you're listening on the podcast. You're going to go to a website, and you can just Google this. It's the Dynamic Regulatory System. Now, this is a newer system by the FAA, and it's kind of the repository for all the regulations. So you have a search diagram or a search bar that pops up on the left-hand side. There's actually two search bars. You want to search on the left and type TCDS. TCDS, I can spell that, and that's going to pull up your type certificate data sheets. It's going to say loading here, and then you're going to have a make and model, and we're going to do 172, so Cessna 172, and we're going to see, okay, 172, we'll say we're in a 172 Lima is what we want. Then it's really important that we hit apply here, and we're going to scroll down to our search results, and we're going to see the Cessna 172L TCDS number, and that's actually a link to a PDF document that we can pull up and then download if we wanted. So I've got right here the Cessna 172. The TCDS number of the 172 is 3 Alpha 12. So 3 Alpha 12, that's almost as important as 172. And I don't know why they're the same. Don't ask these types of questions. But the 3 Alpha 12 is the TCDS number. And we can do a quick word search. We can search for stall. And right here, it says the basic required equipment as prescribed in the applicable airworthiness requirements must be installed on the aircraft for certification. This equipment must include a current airplane flight manual, effective serial number, and a stall warning indicator, depending on what type of model that you're in. So the TCDS is requiring 2 additional items on top of the arrow that we talked about and tomato flames. Not only do we have to have the aircraft limitations, but we also have to have a current airplane flight manual, an AFM, and we have to have a stall warning indicator. And there's 2 different kinds of stall warning indicators, but it covers the whole span of 172s, from a straight 172 to the 172H and on. So a stall warning indicator must be installed on the airplane. So the next question that might get brought up is, well, yeah, the stall indicator is installed on the airplane, but it doesn't work. So no, if it says that it has to be on there, the assumption is that it's working, right? So it has to be installed and it has to be operative for the airplane to be airworthy. So in this case, if you're out flying an airplane, 172 specifically, and it's got a busted stall warning indicator, technically that plane is not airworthy. Now, it's not required by every 172 that we check the stall warning horn during pre-flight inspection. They do make a little sucker thing that you can hold up to the stall warning, and you can check to make sure that it's making its little whistle. But sometimes we might be doing a check ride, and in the course of doing stalls, we don't hear a stall warning indicator, and we discover, hey, the stall warning indicator is inoperative. This plane is now unairworthy, right? We've got to return to base. We're done. I can't continue the check ride because it has a piece of inoperative equipment that's required per the TCDS. So knowing how to find the TCDS, knowing what it is, that would be a really good thing for you to have prepared for your check ride. So I kind of showed you that website. That would be a good thing to have printed off and at least have the TCDS available. Okay, required, we're down to, that was 3C, we're down to 3D, which is required discrepancy records or placards. So discrepancy records and placards, 2 kind of completely different things, really. But discrepancy records are, okay, if there is a discrepancy found, do you have a list of that? You know, do we know, hey, this is inoperative and it's been addressed. Here's how it was addressed. Here's when it was rendered inoperative. And there's the placard. The placards are, okay, I've got 2 different kinds of placards. Placards for inoperative equipment. Then I also have placards that are required by the flight manual. So the Cessna flight manual has a section in it that says, hey, here's all the required placards on the plane. What a lot of people don't understand, if any of those placards are missing and they're required by the flight manual, then the airplane is inoperative, right? The airplane is not airworthy because it's missing a required placard. This is something really common that I see, especially on owner-provided aircraft. It's not part of a flight school, all right? It's not a standardized fleet with a professional maintenance, crew behind it. It's, just a guy that owns an airplane and he hires some AMP to do his annual. This is really common to have somebody miss, hey, there's a required placard per the flight manual. It's not in this airplane. It doesn't look like it's been in this airplane for years. We need to add that. And that's as simple as it is. If there's a missing placard, just add the placard back. It's not like, well, we got to throw away the airplane. That's not it at all. So you have placards required by the flight manual. You also have placards required by aftermarket, modifications made to the aircraft. So I'll cover one of these. Is really common. It's come up a few times, and that's a 180 horsepower Cessna 172. There's a supplemental type certificate for the Cessna 172 that allows you to put a higher horsepower engine, in this case 180 horsepower engine, on the airplane. Now, that STC, there's a couple of different kinds of STCs there. A lot of them require a placard to be added to the airplane somewhere, visible to the pilot, that tells the pilot, hey, this plane has a bigger engine. There's also that STC sometimes includes a higher gross weight. So I think the 172 is typically a max gross weight of 2,300 pounds. There's a 2,550 STC, and that requires a placard as well of like, hey, pilot, not only does this plane have a bigger engine, it can also weigh up to 2,500 pounds, and in order to have that 2,500 pounds and be legal, you have to have these kinds of tires. So that placard is actually telling me a lot of important information. I've got to now, okay, I've got the placard, I know about the STC, I've got to verify that we have the right tires on the airplane. So see how this gets complicated pretty quickly? And just by doing a little bit of research beforehand, you can identify all this stuff and avoid kind of some embarrassing situations or potentially check ride ending situations because you don't know the knowledge for the plane that you're using. Now, already I've used an acronym that I haven't fully fleshed out, and that's STC. So let's talk about supplemental type certificates for a second. This is also a weak area that I see in my private pilot candidates. And again, I don't expect you to be able to build an airplane as a private pilot. And I probably, I don't know how many minutes I've been going here, but it's easy maybe for you to listen to this and get a little overwhelmed and think, man, Seth, I don't know half the stuff that you're talking about. Well, that's why you're listening to this. And remember, I'm not, perfection isn't the standard. It's kind of similar to a written exam. You're going to get some of these questions wrong, or you're going to be a little unclear on some of the answers that you give, as long as you're not showing consistency in not knowing things during the oral exam. You're not going to receive a disapproval from an examiner. So you're doing the right thing. Don't get overwhelmed. Just take it one step at a time. So this next little step that we're going to talk about is the supplemental type certificate. And what is that? So I kind of used that house analogy earlier. If 91205 is our foundation, the TCDS is our house that we built, and STC is like that addition that we put on our house a few years after we've lived there, right? Maybe we put a pool house in the back and put in a pool. Well, if you live in city limits, you had to have a building permit for that too. Now, you didn't have to re-inspect your entire house. You just had to inspect kind of the new part that got on and get some sort of building permit. That's a pretty good analogy for how STCs work. Is I buy this airplane, it comes with a 160 horsepower engine, and then a few years later I decide to put a 180 horsepower engine on it. Well, the airplane's airworthiness certificate, all that still has to be good, but now I have to get this new engine, this new modification. I get a supplemental type certificate to add to supplement the original type certificate. So I have this supplemental type certificate. So that's required if I have any kind of aftermarket things done to my airplane. Now there's also of course there is, right? This always gets more complicated. But there's also something called a field approval. So if we add something to our airplane and we didn't do it through an STC process, we might have done it through a field process and just have it's a Form 337. And that's basically a piece of paperwork filed with the FAA that shows that you've somehow altered the airplane, and you've done that under the guidance and approval of an AMP-IA. So a Form 337 might be something that gets added to an airplane if there was a major damage done. Okay, so this is a good topic. Let's say that you're flying at a flight school. You're flying an airplane that last year it ran off the side of the road and it bent the wing. Okay, bent the wing. They had to take the plane out of service. They pulled the right wing off, and they replaced it with a new right wing. There's going to be a big write-up in the maintenance logs showing that. And so you're nervous because you're coming up to your check ride, and there's this huge, write-up in the last annual about how the right wing of this plane was removed, and we put a new wing on there. As a pilot, you should know that in addition to that, I should also have a 337 that says, hey, I did a major repair on this airplane, installed this wing. Here's the process that I went through, all that. I'm getting, maybe a little beyond my depth here. I'm not going to use this specific scenario in a check ride. I'm just trying to, there's other examiners that might. So this is an example of why a 337 would be done for a field approval. Other things that you might see 337s for are maybe there's a special door with some sort of camera hole that's in it because this plane was used for aerial photography. Sometimes those modifications are done via a 337 rather than an STC. So the main thing is a 337 and STC kind of do the similar thing or similar things. They document how we've added aftermarket things or done alterations to our airplane. The main difference is an STC is something that's kind of scalable. Anybody can go out and purchase that STC and do that modification, whereas field approvals are more kind of one-off deals, right? They're very specific to that airplane, and I can't take that airplane's field approval and use the same paperwork to do the same alteration to another plane. I would have to get an STC if I wanted to kind of scale that and turn it into a production type thing. So that's STCs. It's important for you to know when you're flying an airplane with an STC because those can require different things to be added to the flight manual. So let's think about that engine, for instance. If we have that engine upgrade done to our airplane, we might have new performance numbers that have to get added to our flight manual. So the maybe cruise performance numbers we have on our flight manual are no longer valid because we have a different power plant on the plane. So that would be really important, right? That might lead to a disapproval in the check ride if you planned your whole check ride using a 160 horsepower engine with 160 horsepower fuel burn, but the plane we're flying is 180 horse, has a different fuel burn, different speed, right? You got the planning completely wrong. So make sure that you're familiar with any STCs installed on your airplane and any requirements for the flight manuals to be on board the airplane, because there might be those supplements to the flight manuals you have. All right, so we're through all of the knowledge topics. Now we're on to risk management. There only is one risk management item, and that is inoperative equipment discovered prior to flight. So you can tell we've obviously covered that already in the scenario. We've talked about several different scenarios where we've discovered inoperative equipment and how we're going to deal with that. Typically, we'll talk around the scenario, and part of the scenario will be flying with inoperative equipment, and part of it I'll be looking for you to say, no, I'm not going to fly with this equipment inoperative. So I'll kind of lead you to that decision point, and then I'll say, okay, new airplane, new day. We'll say that is no longer an issue, so let's continue on and assume the airplane's good to go now. I'm just looking to make sure you can make a go, no-go decision based on inoperative equipment, because that's also a key thing here is, as risk management, as a pilot in command, back to that turn coordinator example, we could legally go fly with an inoperative turn coordinator, but if for whatever reason, as the PIC, you think, no, that turn coordinator, for me, that needs to be operative, that's fine. You're the pilot in command. You can make that decision. Just because the rules say you can fly with something that's inoperative doesn't mean that you have to. So using that higher level judgment, aeronautical decision making, as it were, and making a decision to not fly because of inoperative equipment, completely fine. All right, now we're to the skills. So the skills, this are the meat of this task, right? We have to demonstrate proficiency in all three skills, and what you'll notice is we've pretty much done that already talking through the scenarios. So skill 1, locate and describe airplane airworthiness and registration information. Okay, we did that. Skill 2, determine the airplane is airworthy in a scenario given by the evaluator. So we've talked about several scenarios. So be prepared to think in terms of those scenarios that I've given to answer this skill. And then skill 3, apply appropriate procedure for operating with inoperative equipment in a scenario given by the evaluator. So skill 3 is required, right? Your examiner should give you some sort of scenario where you make the decision to fly with inoperative equipment. So that will come up. It might be an inoperative turn coordinator. It might be an inoperative landing light. It might be an inoperative radio, whatever it might be. You might also have actual inoperative equipment on your airplane. This is a good hack to your check ride here is, if you're planning on using this specific tail number at your flight school and you know that it has an inoperative VOR, that's kind of a good thing, right? Because, okay, I've got VOR 1 works. VOR 2 is inoperative. It's placarded correctly. The logbook entry where it was disabled is in the logbook, and I can point to that. I'm actually going to bring that up in the check ride and say, okay, Mr. DPE or Mrs. DPE, we're flying November 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 today. It has an inoperative VOR 2. Here's a picture I've taken of the placard in the airplane. It's been, the circuit breaker for the VOR 2 has been pulled, and we have an appropriate placard. I've checked 91205, the TCDS, and our mission requirements today, and have decided as a pilot in command that it's safe for us to fly with that equipment inoperative. Man, you just made my job easier as an examiner, right? You basically covered skill 3, area of operation 1, task B. You did it. That's it. So if you're flying with a plane that has inoperative equipment, don't be worried about it. That's a good thing. Just be prepared to talk about it because it is required per skill 3 in the ACS. Okay, so we've covered several different scenarios on airworthiness. I've talked through some of the regulations there. There are, if you're using my ACE guide, which again, I strongly recommend you get this ACE guide. Again, great way to support me as a content creator. It's not a membership fee. You pay a one-time fee. I give you updates forever. But on here, I've done a couple of things, giving you some links. So the first one that I'll show you is this prep guide. So again, this works in ForeFlight. You just tap on it. It's going to take you to an external link. This prep guide is from the FAA Wings site. And this one is on ALC 25. That is the course number, and it's called the Flight Review Prep Guide. I've linked this in here because this is actually a really good online course. It's completely free, and I know you're not taking a flight review when you're taking a check ride, but all the items that this talks about are pertinent to a check ride as well. So this is a great tool to sit down, after you listen to this podcast or watch my videos, go on and take this course, and it gives you an end-of-course exam. If you're an instructor listening to this, you can assign this test to your students, and they're going to have to take an end-of-course exam, and it can show you a completion certificate. You also get wings credit for this, so that's really good. But I've linked that in there. It has a lot of good resources on flying with inoperative equipment, so that's why I've linked that. The next one that I have is an equipment chart. Now this will pull up a sub-window of 91207, 91209 required equipment for day VFR, for night VFR. This is an FAA document. I know it says 91207 and 91209. This is straight from the FAA. I think the old one, don't let that throw you off. This is a good table here. Just ignore that the 91205 is the actual current one. But this is a good picture that basically says, hey, for day of VFR, engine condition, here's all the engine stuff I need, here's the performance navigation that I need, and here's the safety information or safety stuff that I need for both day VFR, night VFR, IFR. So I've added that in the ACE guide. The next chart that I have here is your flow chart. So this is a really good flow chart for you to use, and again, this is straight from the FAA, of saying, okay, I've got inoperative equipment, what do I do? And this is literally a flow chart you can go down, and if you answer all the questions, it'll tell you, hey, you can fly with it inoperative, maintenance is required, or the plane's unairworthy. Yeah, so this is a good flow chart for you to use, and just something to add to kind of your bag of tricks, as it were. The other thing included on the ACE guide is an example scenario out of the 8900.1. We've pretty much covered everything in this scenario. It's very similar to the one that I discussed here, but that's there for your reference as well. Now let's look around at some other items in the ACE guide included in this. So if we go back to our global menu and we go to the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, or the PHAK, the PHAK is embedded in here, and we have Chapter 9 of the PHAK, which is Flight Manuals and Other Documents. So we've got A through H in this Chapter 9 here. And this covers airplane flight manuals, aircraft documents, and MEL, preventative maintenance, ADs, aircraft operator responsibilities. This is a good chapter to cover that goes really well with Area of Operation 1, Task B, is Chapter 9 of the PHAC, and that's also included here in the ACE guide. So again, the ACE guide, that's just an example of how that kind of makes your cross-referencing a lot easier, because most of the stuff that you need, including links to the FARs as well as the Aeronautical Information Manual, are included in this document. So really hope that you continue to find this helpful to go through this, helping prepare you not only to be successful in your check ride, but also to be a safer pilot. So even if you have a pilot friend that's already successfully taken their private pilot, kind of look at this as this is free professional development. So you can pop an earbud in, listen to this podcast. I guarantee you're going to learn some stuff. And if you're preparing for a check ride, it's going to help you be successful. I promise. Hundreds of people have reached out to me to say that the content that I've helped create helps them be successful at their check ride. So it's just a part of a part of a balanced approach to studying for your check ride. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. I know there's a lot of options out there, and I really hope that you found it helpful. I will talk to you next time. See ya.